This is part 4 of the newly renovated and expanded historic auto attractions in Roscoe, Illinois. We are continuing through the brand new East Wing. Here are some wax figures of famous authors and artists, including Mark Twain, Rembrandt, the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, Ernest Hemingway, Vincent van Gogh, and Pablo Picasso. This is a really awesome group. These were Thomas Edison's reading glasses. First Lady Florence Harding wore this black cape on Election Day in 1920, when her husband Warren G. Harding won the presidency, and when she became the first First Lady to ever vote. There's the black mourning purse and mourning veil of Florence Harding. She wore that during the funeral of President Harding in 1923. There is a conspiracy that Florence poisoned the president. Those were Florence Harding's formal doveskin gloves that she wore at the White House. There's an admission pass to President Harding's funeral service, and that was an admission card for the interment of the first unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. This is the Lincoln exhibit. It's about the same as it used to be, but it is among the best collections of Abraham Lincoln artifacts out there. This is a replica of the carriage that Abraham Lincoln took to Ford's Theater on the fateful night of April 14th, 1865. The real one is at the Studebaker National Museum in South Bend, Indiana. There are locks of Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln's hair. This Lincoln portrait is composed of different antique objects, including an 1860s patriotic envelope featuring the Constitution, some tintypes, and some Civil War era newspapers. Here's a seated wax figure of Abraham Lincoln. Many of the wax figures here were from an old museum, but I'm not sure from where. This chair was in Abraham Lincoln's study at the White House, so he presumably sat in this chair frequently during some very difficult times. And this chair was also used by Abraham Lincoln in his fancy presidential rail car. Notice the fabric is worn at the end of the seat. That was apparently caused by Lincoln getting up and down. The shoes and the dress were owned and worn by First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln. This is a funeral dress that was worn by Eliza Blair at Lincoln's funeral. She was the wife of Francis Blair, a longtime Democrat who stayed loyal to the Union and served as an advisor to Lincoln throughout the war. This is an incredible relic. The 35-star flag that was carried by President Lincoln's bodyguard and flag bearer, Master Sergeant Stimmel. This flag was very likely present at the Gettysburg Address and many other important events. There's a land grant that was signed by Lincoln, and some vintage postcards of the Lincoln home. There's a little section of burial cloth that was used in Lincoln's final funeral service at Oak Ridge Cemetery. This was Mary Todd Lincoln's mourning veil. She wore this during the president's funeral ceremonies in DC, but she couldn't bear to attend the rest. She wore mourning attire like this throughout the rest of her life, and that was her mourning fan, also all black, and there's a rare CDV of the First Lady by Matthew Brady. That was Abraham Lincoln's razor. He stopped using it after getting a letter from a little girl who said he'd be more electable if he grew a beard. There's also his spoon, and a piece of roof from the house that Lincoln's father, Thomas, married his stepmother, Sally Bush Johnston. That house in Elizabethtown, Kentucky no longer stands. There's some Civil War battlefield relics. A lock of John Brown's hair. And some Lincoln dollars. This reed pump organ belonged to the Lincolns. Mary would play it in the White House. There's some old photographs of the log cabins that Lincoln grew up in. I don't believe any of those survived. And there's a colonial style dollhouse. This is a replica of Lincoln's death chair, the one he was sitting in at Ford's Theater when he was shot. And that's an authentic piece of the upholstery from that chair. It is now at the Henry Ford Museum. The window frame is from the home of William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, and there's a piece of the original Rutledge New Salem mill dam, which was at the small town where Lincoln lived during his 20s. Here are prints and photographs of the 3 weeks of Lincoln funeral events. There's an authentic piece of the Lincoln funeral catafalque, and a ribbon from it. The catafalque is still used today for those who lie in state in the rotunda of the US Capitol, and this piece was obtained by Captain Alexander Austin, who was part of Lincoln's honor guard. That's a hubcap from the gun caisson that carried the Lincoln assassination conspirators' bodies after they were hanged, and those were the manacles worn by Lewis Payne, or Lewis Powell, who was in on the conspiracy and stabbed Secretary of State William Seward to near death that night. This is the doorknob from Mary Surratt's boarding house, where the conspirators gathered to plan the Lincoln assassination, and there's a lock of Mary Surratt's hair. She was the first woman hanged in US history. These are fragments of bandages that were around Mary Surratt's hands when hanged, along with some bits of the hanging ropes. This plaque used to be at the site where Abraham Lincoln and John Todd Stewart had their law office in Springfield. I don't believe that location is marked anymore. This was Mary Todd Lincoln's mourning skirt. She first wore this when their son Willie died at the White House in 1862, and then again after her husband was slain. That coin was placed on Abraham Lincoln's eyelid just after he passed away in the Peterson boarding house. Placing coins on the eyes of the deceased was a common practice back then, and this is the handkerchief that was wrapped around Lincoln's jaw just after he expired to keep his jaw closed until rigor mortis set in. It is clearly stained with the president's blood. These handles were on Lincoln's original outer coffin. They were removed in 1874 when they exhumed Lincoln to put him in the new tomb and to check on him. This drapery cord was placed on a window curtain at the Springfield home after he died. This is the only surviving section of the carpet on which Lincoln stood during his second inauguration in March of 1865. He gave one of his greatest speeches while standing on this carpet. And this coat was worn to Abraham Lincoln's second inauguration. Not sure by who, but it was there. The Lincoln collection here is astounding. This is a sculpture of Ganesha, an elephant-headed Hindu god who is known as the remover of obstacles. Here's a new display I was interested in seeing: the Hall of Christ. It's set up like a little chapel with the Last Supper in wax. This wax tableau may have been at an older wax museum. There are a few others out there, but this three-dimensional reproduction of Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting is really cool. There's Judas. There are also these 20 pieces of original stone which the Crusaders used to build the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre over Jesus' tomb in Jerusalem. This alcove is a 9/11 memorial. It looks like it is centered around the original blueprints of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in Manhattan. They broke ground on the Twin Towers in 1966 and were completed in 1973. They were two of the tallest buildings in the country, and decades later came crashing down in the most horrific terrorist attack in US history on September 11th, 2001. The walls have pictures from 9/11, a tribute to Flight 93, and a wall with the names of all those killed. There are some cars in the hallway connecting these exhibits, including some gems like Colonel Sanders' car. This classic 1939 Lincoln K limousine was chauffeur-driven for Colonel Harlan Sanders during special events. This is the only known surviving example of the Packard 7 Pass. It was built in 1917 and has some features not found in most Packard cars. This was Howard Hughes' personal limousine. The eccentric billionaire once rode around in this. This was also the car that started this collection. And next to it is a hand-carved eagle made out of a single piece of wood. Here's an exhibit on Harry Houdini, the great magician. This was Harry Houdini's burlap straitjacket. He would use this in his famous straitjacket escape act. He claimed that he had to dislocate his shoulders in order to get the arms through, which wasn't true. This was one of Houdini's traveling show trunks. And here are some leg and handcuffs used by Houdini during his performances, along with his key-making die. That's a slice of petrified wood. It's 160 million years old. You can see some way bigger chunks in Holbrook, Arizona. And this is the ocular device that was worn by Nicolas Cage in National Treasure. These were created by Benjamin Franklin, and Nicolas Cage used these to read the map on the back of the Declaration of Independence. This is pretty awesome. A chariot that was screen used in the 1959 Ben-Hur, starring Charlton Heston. I'm not sure if this was used during the glorious chariot race scene. Here's an exhibit on Egyptian artifacts. No, they unfortunately don't have any real ones. These are just Egyptian movie props, which are still really neat. This costume was worn by Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra in the classic 1963 Cleopatra film. This Egyptian-themed chair was also in that film. These bracelets were screen used in the Cecil DeMille epic, The Ten Commandments. Here's a gilt-painted statuette of a bird-headed man. This was screen used in Cleopatra. Here are some more screen-used costumes and props from those movies. These are a charioteer's garments from the Ten Commandments. And this stool was also used in Cleopatra. And this case contains a lot of jewelry, necklaces, and a loincloth from the Ten Commandments in 1956, and it's topped by a Roman gladius sword from Cleopatra. There is a small exhibit on country music stars. There used to be a lot more country memorabilia, so I think this area is a work in progress. Inside this giant guitar there is a wax figure of Johnny Cash and a gown of June Carter. This fantastic 1957 Lincoln Continental Mark II was owned and driven by Conway Twitty. It's one of the fanciest Mark IIs ever built. This suit jacket was stage worn by Conway Twitty, and this was Conway Twitty's guitar. Here's a full case of country legend Hank Williams memorabilia. That's one of Hank Williams' shirts. There's a picture of him performing while wearing this one. Hank Williams wore this hat during his final performances with the Louisiana Hayride. There's another one of Hank Williams' hats and his glasses. And here's another one of his shirts. There's a lip impression of Billie Jean Williams Horton, the wife of Hank Williams, and after he died she married Johnny Horton, who sang the Battle of New Orleans. And here's a display on Patsy Cline, another one of the greatest country musicians. This was Patsy Cline's dress. Those were her boots and her wigs. She had to wear wigs after a horrible car crash she was involved in that left scarring. There's one of Cline's hats that she used throughout her career. That's her blouse, shoes, purse, and some more items down there. This is another new exhibit called A Journey Through Time. It features a bunch of antique clocks. There are hundreds of beautiful timepieces spanning several centuries within these cases. There's also two antique pianos and an organ. This exhibit does seem to be a work in progress as well. Here are some presidential clocks of the White House. This Victorian walnut clock was owned by President Grover Cleveland. On the left is a Zachary Taylor campaign clock, and next to it a clock from fellow General President Eisenhower's library, and next to that is a clock used in the White House during the Coolidge years. The Sessions mantle clock on the left was used during the Hoover administration. Next to it is a clock from Harry Truman's White House study, and on the right a mantle clock used during Taft's presidency. There's also a clock that was used in the White House library during the FDR years, and next to it is a signed Seth Thomas wall clock gifted to Andrew Jackson at the White House. This one is really interesting. It's the Market Garden clock. It was presented to General Eisenhower by the exiled Dutch government to honor Operation Market Garden, which failed as it was a bridge too far. Eisenhower kept this clock in the White House, but insisted that it not be wound or used at all because it reminded him of the failure. This grandfather clock was presented to President Truman in 1950 by the Senate. It was used in the East Room and the East Hall of the White House. This is one of the new celebrity artifacts at historic auto attractions, Miss Belvedere. This was a new 1957 Plymouth Belvedere that in 1957 was buried and sealed in an underground vault in Tulsa, Oklahoma as a time capsule. Various objects from the 50s were placed inside this classic 50s car. Its said opening date was in 2007, exactly 50 years later. So in 2007, Miss Belvedere was finally unearthed. Unfortunately, the vault it was placed in was breached by water, so the car was clearly kinda messed up by water damage. The interior of the car is definitely dirty. But the unveiling of this car was a big deal in Tulsa, and now she's here at historic auto attractions. Very cool. Looks like a war room exhibit is under construction. I'd really like to see this. I think I know of a few things they have that are going to be inside. This is the one and only prototype of the 1967 Maz Ostentatienne Opera Sedan, built by the Maz Seaplane Company in Madison, Wisconsin. This car was designed to be the ultimate mode of personal transportation with the greatest of safety specifications. And many celebrities rode in this bizarre prototype, including Johnny Carson, Glenn Campbell, Joan Crawford, Jimmy Dean, Lawrence Welk, and more. And this is a safari car built in 1973 by the Maz Seaplane Company. This car was designed to go on wild safaris in Africa, and the seats could be lowered to turn into a sleeper. Next to it is the pelt of a Bengal tiger. That's Santa's sleigh. That just seems like a vintage one, but because it's this museum, it wouldn't surprise me at all if this belonged to Santa Claus. This is a 1928 Franklin Airman passenger limousine. Here's a classic 1912 Model T Roadster with a mother-in-law seat in the back. This 1929 Ford Model A was used as a taxi cab in Crested Butte, Colorado. And here's a 1924 Fordson tractor. These were the first tractors produced on assembly line by Ford. It cost $400 in the 20s, so it was fairly affordable. Way in the back of the new expansion, even though there is some space still walled off for more displays, is the racing exhibit. This GT was driven by Davy Jones. Terry Kaiser won the 1987 and 1988 IDBA Funny Bike National Championship with this bike and set some records with it. These are the driving suits of Don Prudhomme and John Force. This was Mario Andretti's 1991 Indy car. He drove this in the Indy 500 that year and came in 7th. Here's a vintage 1929 Indy car. This was raced in the 1929 Indy 500. Here's Joe Amato's Hemi-powered top fuel dragster from 1991. Joe Amato won the NHRA Fuel Top Championship 5 times. And behind it is another elongated dragster, a 1960 Slingshot which was rather dangerous. This is a 1984 sprint car. It was driven by Harold Wertjes, who accumulated over 100 wins in this car. Here's a 1955 Buick Nailhead Dragster. This is a cool relic, a mechanic's jacket from the early Indy 500 races. The first one was in 1911, and back then a mechanic had to ride on the race cars. There's a helmet and goggles from one of those early Indy races. That's a racing piston signed by Dale Earnhardt. And that's a chunk of blacktop from the original Daytona Speedway, the old beach and road race course that was used before the present Speedway opened in 1959. There's some really big stuff over here. This is a Sikorsky S-61 helicopter transmission. Marine One, the presidential helicopter, uses this same transmission. This is a hydroplane, a super fast boat that skims over water. This boat used to be out in front of the museum. Not sure what its significance is. This is Bigfoot, known as the king of the monster trucks. It was built by Bob Chandler in 1979 and is 15 feet tall. It has some colossal tires, wow. This is a Tora motorcycle that was built by Rockford Motors right near here in Rockford, Illinois. It is in its original crate. This is the Bonneville Boss, a 1975 LSR hauler. It's also called a tornado-powered lowboy transporter that would carry the Proud American, that rocket on the top, that was used for land speed racing at the Bonneville Salt Flats of Utah. And this was one of Craig Breedlove's Spirit of America land speeders that he used on the Bonneville Salt Flats. He broke a lot of speed records with these vehicles. This was the first Ford car that ever climbed Pikes Peak in Colorado on July 1st, 1916. It's a 1914 Model T, and it participated in the Pikes Peak Hill Climb on the brand new Pikes Peak Auto Highway. A 15-year-old in Texas convinced his parents to take the Model T and take a family trip to do the race. It took several days to prepare and several days to ascend Pikes Peak during that time. They were the first ones to reach the 14,000 foot high summit during that race. And here's a Florida swamp buggy racer. This was the first trophy presented to race car driver Cotton Owens at Daytona for Fast Qualifier in 1959. That's an antique midget racer. This was Dick Trickle's 1970 purple Mustang. He made 67 record-setting short track victories with this car. That was a 1977 Monte Carlo winner, here in this other section full of race cars. And this was another one of Dick Trickle's cars. In the very back is the Illinois Stock Car Hall of Fame. The owner of this museum builds race car chassis and has long been involved with stock car racing. So here's the local Hall of Fame for the motorsport, featuring lots of memorabilia of the inductees. Here's a 1940s Ford Coupe dirt stock race car. If it looks like it was found after rotting away in a field for decades, that's because it was. So that's the new expansion of historic auto attractions. It's amazing, and it looks like there's more to come in this massive space. But it's not over. Continue the tour back in the original building with part 5. All episodes are linked in the description. Thanks for watching.